The terrifying case of the elusive Golden State Killer haunted law enforcement for decades and left dozens of victims living in fear. Today, the LA Times launches a new podcast that explores the origins of one of California's most notorious serial killers.
Hello? Hello?
If you lived in Sacramento during that time frame, you have a story of what happened and where you were and what was going on. During that time frame, everybody was in fear. We had people sleeping with shotguns, we had people purchasing dogs, we had locksmiths. Business went way out of control because of the fact that everybody was changing locks on their doors. People were concerned, and they had a right to be. This guy was terrorizing the community.
This phantom collected many names: the Visalia Ransacker, the original Night Stalker, the East Area Rapist, and then the Golden State Killer.
The case started in 1976. Started on June 18, 1976 with a rape of a female in the Rancho Cordova, Carmichael area of Sacramento. It extended beyond there with 24 different attacks here in Sacramento, where rapes of single females and/or individual would break into the house, attack a couple, and rape the female. He would pry open windows and doors, would then proceed to the bedroom, shine a flashlight in their eyes. They would see a dark figure with a ski mask on. He would then have the female bind the male. He would then bind the female individual. The house would be ransacked. Other items would be taken, whatever he could find.
Because I live in Northern California, and in fact, right in the area where many of the rapes took place, and from there became enmeshed in the culture of rape at the time, the victims who were attacked, and the struggles that they went through.
It was quite late. It wasn't midnight. It was much later than that.
And what woke you?
Tap on the window. And I just pulled just a thin cotton curtain on the window, and I pulled it back.
And the first thing you saw
Was the gun.
He's not concerned about human life. He enjoys the terror. He enjoys inflicting that type of an emotional type pain on people.
When the LA Times comes to us with a project, we listen. And this particular story kind of broke the mold. This one was huge, so it spanned decades.
He says, when you look at this, you can believe in the devil, because he says evil is out there among us. Evil is stalking us all the time.
He's got to be one of the most prolific criminals when you think of the other murder cases that are connected and all the rape cases. And God knows what else we don't know about.
From the Los Angeles Times and Wondery, the partnership that brought you Dirty John, this is Man in the Window, the untold story of the origins of the Golden State Killer and why he was never stopped.
Reporter Paige St. John has provided extensive coverage of the case for the Times and hosts Man in the Window. Why use this form? Why use the podcast?
The podcast provides a rare opportunity to listen intimately to the voices of the women who are the victims. These are women who've been silent for largely half a century. Being raped in the 70s was a taboo, and some were forced to never even talk about their attacks. The podcast is a rare opportunity to hear their voices. In its immersion into 70s culture, the rhetoric of the times was so intense, so heated. This was the rise of the women's movement. This series of crimes and murders begin at a time when rape is not considered great bodily harm in California. I actually found documents and reports where he's called a gentle rapist. And this is a man who's terrifying people, threatening to kill them, threatening to chop off the ears of the children down the hall, and to see that kind of language in the reports was a quite astounding.
At this point, Joseph DeAngelo is a suspect. He hasn't been tried and been allowed to present a defense. But tell us who this suspect is.
Joseph DeAngelo is a fascinating individual, in part because he begins as a Vietnam vet who comes back to the country. He's getting a college degree. He meets this woman named Bonnie, who's a very outgoing and a very smart woman, and he aspires to be a trooper for the California Highway Patrol. So you start from there, and how do you go from that kind of trajectory to a night mechanic at a grocery store chain? He's been caught shoplifting, a hammer and dog repellent of all things, and to be accused of some 225 different crimes, 13 murders, 50 rapes, 125 home invasions just in Visalia alone. And yet Joseph DeAngelo is father of 3 daughters, married to a feminist lawyer. So
It doesn't seem to, it seems incongruous.
It doesn't jive.
Doesn't add
at
up.
all. And not even for the people who knew him and know him very closely.
But law enforcement always suspected they were dealing with someone that had law enforcement background or military background because of the way he attacked his victims and covered his tracks. You mentioned Visalia, over 100 break-ins. 72 to 75, the break-ins in Visalia. 1976, the rapes began. How many?
50 sexual assaults and rapes. Some women were sodomized at the time, and they did not count that as rape. And that's that they know of. They suspect earlier rapes in 73 even.
Then it escalates. In 1978, the murders begin. And how many murders?
You have 3 murders before the serial murder kind of takes off. Those first 3 killings are almost part of a self-defense or evasion to avoid being identified. But later, the last 10 victims are couples who are stalked, who are attacked in their bedrooms, who are bound and then bludgeoned to death.
He has a daughter who's born in 1981, and the killings actually stopped for 5 years.
Yes, for a while, yes. And there's a theory among detectives, including Paul Holes, that psychologically he was done at that point with the birth of his daughters until one more murder in 1986.
He also had an explosive temper, according to people who heard him screaming, and usually over sort of mundane things.
Yeah, mostly at himself. I have 2 boys who grew up in the backyard, and from the home behind his, and they would describe him being in his little patch of grass in his backyard, pacing at 2 a.m., screaming at himself.
Again, it's going to be fascinating to hear this personal story. Again, his wife, an accomplished attorney, one of his daughters is a doctor, works in the emergency room, and yet to attack women and men, but so many women, so much damage, if in fact this case is proven against him. Paige, it's going to be so interesting. We will learn more as we listen to your podcast and, of course, the upcoming trial. Episode 1 of the new investigative podcast, Man in the Window, is available for download at latimes.com. We will all be following along.